que nos assistem ao canal do UFRJ. Hoje teremos a aula inaugural desse período letivo excepcional, também de forma excepcional, realizada sob um formato de webinar e transmitida no YouTube. E também contaremos com um convidado excepcional, o professor Ha-Joon Chang, de Cambridge. A aula será ministrada em inglês e feita essa breve introdução, me dirigirei a vocês e ao professor Chang em inglês. Hello again, everyone. On behalf of the Institute of Economics of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, I would like to thank Professor Ha-Joon Chang for accepting our invitation for this lecture. Professor Chang, we are deeply honored to have you in charge of this lecture. With the worldwide spread of the COVID-19, we are going through a period of great uncertainty. The pandemic is strongly affecting our economy and society, and posing great challenges for the world, and particularly for Brazil, which was already in a fragile economic and political situation before its arrival, in addition to the profound economic and social inequality that characterize our country. In that sense, it will be extremely opportune to hear what Professor Chang has to say about COVID-19 impacts on the economy and the society. Before giving the spot to my colleagues, Norberto Martins and Lídia Bouchier, who will be our hosts today, I would like to thank Marta Castilho, our Director of Graduate Studies, and Mateus Labrin, our former student and now a PhD student at Cambridge, for making this event possible. I also want to thank Guilherme Aguiar for the technical support at YouTube, and Camila Oliveira for the poster and social media. Norberto, please.
Thanks, Fabio. First of all, it's an honor to present Professor Ha-Joon Chang. Professor Chang teaches at the University of Cambridge, where he graduated and earned his PhD. He's the author of several books, such as Bad Samaritans, Rich Nations, Poor Policies, and the Threat to the Developing World, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism, Economics, The User's Guide, and one that is very familiar to us all at UFRJ, this one here, a mandatory book in our economic development classes, Kicking Away the Ladder, Developing Strategy in Historical Perspective. Lídia will complement me in this presentation.
So Professor Chang has served as a consultant to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the European Investment Bank, and several United Nations agencies. He's also a fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., and serves on the advisory board of Academics Stand Against Poverty, ASAP. And in 2013, Prospect Magazine ranked Ha-Joon Chang as one of the top 20 world thinkers. Norberto.
Well, me and Lídia will be the hosts. We'll be moderating today our questions and answers. And Professor Chang will give an opening talk, and then we'll save some time for questions and everything. Please feel free to post your questions in the YouTube chat, and I will turn briefly to Portuguese. Aos nossos alunos e nossos colegas que se sentirem mais à vontade, eventualmente, de colocar uma questão em português, por favor, façam. Eu e a Lídia, a gente está aqui, a gente vai tentar traduzir e passar para o professor Chang, de modo que todo mundo seja contemplado. So, back into English. Without further ado, Professor Chang, the spot is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fabio, Roberto, Lídia, for that kind introduction. Yeah, it's my great pleasure to be able to address the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. The first time I went to Brazil was 1997 in a conference organized by people from your university. And I've been going to Brazil quite often. it feels really strange to talk to you sitting in England. But yeah, these are extraordinary times. And yeah, I mean that we are in this situation exactly because of the pandemic of COVID-19, which has claimed the British Prime Minister, Brazilian President, and finally the US President. So this is affecting everyone, from people living in the favela in Brazil to people living in the White House in Washington, D.C. Truly extraordinary event. Of course, this has caused the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression back in the 1920s and 30s. The IMF, the International Monetary Fund, back in April, when the pandemic was creating a huge economic crisis, projected that world GDP will fall by 3% in 2020. By June, it had downgraded its projection to 5% contraction. It hasn't yet updated this. Maybe it doesn't know what to say, but even these projections were on the assumption that the disease will be brought under reasonable control in the second half of 2020, which is not happening. It's still raging in Brazil and many Latin American countries. In many countries in Europe, that they, through lockdown and everything, dampened the wave. But then the second wave has come. And only in a handful of countries, South Korea, New Zealand, Norway, the disease is in any kind of under any kind of control, and elsewhere is really hugely affecting the economy and society. And just put it into perspective, back in 2008, with the global financial crisis, the world economy contracted by 1%, and now we are talking about at least 5% contraction of the world economy, which is the biggest contraction since the Great Depression. As a result of this contraction, a lot of governments have been propping up enterprises by paying them subsidies, propping up employment by paying companies employment subsidies. Despite this, enterprises have gone bankrupt, people have been laid off. So unemployment has soared, especially in the US, where employment subsidy was limited. Unemployment back in June, July had reached a level that was seen only during the Great Depression. It has come down a bit, but it's still seeing very high unemployment. Of course, the people have not suffered as much as they did during the Great Depression, partly because the economic contraction is still somewhat smaller than what happened during the Great Depression, but mostly because many rich countries in the meantime have built a welfare state. During the Great Depression, virtually no country had the welfare state, but now that many countries, many rich countries have them. And even in some countries that do not have a strong welfare state, governments have paid out income subsidies to the unemployed people. So as a result of this, people have suffered less than they did during the Great Depression, but many governments are slowly reducing these subsidies for enterprises and employment subsidies and then income subsidies. So people's suffering is going to increase in the coming month until the disease is brought under control and the economy is rebuilt. And that will take at least a couple of years. So we are talking about a very long process of economic downturn, great suffering, and the death from disease. Now, this crisis is truly unique in the sense that, like other economic crises, it has involved reduction in output, increase in unemployment, increase in people's sufferings, but it is different from other economic crises in that it is changing the way we run the economy. It's changing the way we live our daily lives. And more importantly, it is forcing us to ask some tough questions about the values and the priorities that we have had about our society and economy. Of course, at this point, it is impossible to predict how things are going to change. The first reason is we don't know how soon and in what manner the disease is going to be brought under control. You know, some people say, oh, there'll be a vaccine in the next the few weeks, like Mr. Donald Trump. And then by next summer, everyone will be vaccinated and will be back to the old ways. I mean, that's a wildly optimistic prediction, totally unrealistic. Most people say basically it'll be at the earliest in the latter part of 2021, more like in 2022, that even if the vaccine comes pretty soon, that most people can get vaccinated and the economy coming back to the normal way. So, you know, if that happens, probably a lot of things will go back to the old ways pretty quickly. But if the control of the disease take any longer, then I think a lot of things will change. But the difficulty of disease control is not the only thing that will determine the course of future event. What changes will happen will also depend on how people as individuals, as groups, as nations, and as a humanity change their values and organize themselves to change the society to implement those values. And exactly who will do what where is rather difficult to predict at this point. So that some of my talk is rather speculative, but having said that, there are the consequences of current crisis that are reasonably easy to predict. So I have, if you can show the PowerPoint, I have divided the changes into two categories. So on the left column, I listed changes that are highly likely and quite predictable. On the right-hand column, I have listed changes that are likely but difficult to predict. So let me go through this one by one, and in the process try to imagine what the future world will be and how we can improve our economy and society during the process. So first of all, there will be long-term scars of this the crisis left behind. I mean, it is well known that when you have an economic crisis as big as this one, or even smaller than this one, when you have the big crisis, it leaves scars in the long run. Some economists call this the hysteresis effect. So if one enterprise goes bankrupt in normal time, the assets that the enterprise had, the workers who used to work there, the managers who used to work there, get not always, but that usually get rather quickly redeployed. You know? So the firm is shut down, the assets are sold to other companies, workers find jobs elsewhere, and so on. But when you have a general collapse in enterprises, like what we are seeing these days, this redeployment and reorganization cannot happen quickly, because there's, I mean, a lot of bankruptcies, there are no new enterprises emerging. So as a result, you will see a lot of scrapping of assets, decay in worker skills, and the different, disappearances of productive knowledge embodied in enterprise. So if the enterprise goes bankrupt and it just disappears, the knowledge that was embodied in the enterprise will disappear. Even if you set up another enterprise like it, when the economy recovers, a lot of knowledge will have been lost, because the organizations accumulate institutional knowledge over time, and that goes away when the enterprise goes away. Also, individuals who experience unemployment and reduction in income during the crisis will see their productive potentials reduced, because with unemployment and reduction in income, their personal debts will increase. Partly as a result of that, they'll experience a physical and mental health crisis. Younger people might see disruptions in their education and training. So even after the economy recovers, these people will emerge out of the crisis with diminished abilities. The second highly likely and predictable changes are changes that are going on, that will happen in the method of production in many industries. First of all industries that involve close proximity of people, whether they are consumers or producers, need to change the way they do business. We have already seen huge changes in various face-to-face services. So restaurants are accepting fewer people, they have screens, shops are limiting the number of people who can be in the same space at the same time. The cashiers have the screens in front of them to protect themselves. Education has gone online largely. Tourism has been destroyed. International tourism, especially entertainment industry, the theaters, cinemas, or the sporting events, these are all going through huge adjustment in the way they do business. Also, we are seeing a huge increase in the proportion of office workers working from home, because having a lot of people in the same office space is dangerous. So a lot of people are working from home. A lot of labor-intensive industries like garment making or food processing have to change the production method, because these are typical industries where a lot of people are concentrated in the small space and that work very close to each other. In the US, in Germany, in many countries, for example, the meat processing factories turned out to be major sources of infection, because the workers are working very close to each other. So a lot of these are changing their production method. So other crises, when they happen, they just lead to the shutting down of enterprises and reduction in output. This crisis, because of this, its root is the pandemic is forcing us to change the way we produce things. Now, of course, some of these changes will quickly revert to the old ways once the pandemic is brought under control. So, for example, the theaters will open again when the pandemic is brought under control, and basically do the business in essentially similar ways. Maybe there'll be a bit more spacing, maybe there'll be a bit more ventilation and the sanitization, but it will be essentially the same thing. But a lot of things will not go back to the old ways, especially in terms of office work. Many companies and workers have realized that actually home working can be very productive. Some companies are even saying that workers are more productive when they work from home. And yeah, this is not likely to change. And then it will have huge knock-on effect, because this means that companies will not need so much the commercial real estate. Why have big and expensive buildings at the city center where rent is very expensive? They could have a much smaller space and save a lot of money as a result. And then the workers that can work from home, and that will also have an effect on how on the housing demand, because a lot of office workers now need the space to work in their house. And a lot of people are, I don't know about Brazil, but in the UK, in the US, a lot of people are now beginning to look for bigger houses that are further away from city center, so that they can have bigger space. So a lot of these changes are going to remain. Okay, the third group of changes that are highly likely and predictable are changes in the consumption structure. Of course, the details are more complex than what I'm going to say, but basically the demands for face-to-face services, like the ones that I have just discussed, will decline compared to the demands for remote services, like business services. So the companies in, I don't know, India doing back office work for American Airlines, or the British the banks. These kind of remote services, in relative terms, the demand for them will increase. But the demand for services will decline in relative terms compared to demands for physical goods. Of physical goods, the demands for manufactured goods, especially healthcare products and electronics products, will rise in relative terms. So, to give you a bit of a kind of graphic example, so someone might have been saving a lot of money to be able to participate in the carnival in Rio, but then this person realizes that she cannot go to Brazil at least for a few years, and she might use that money to buy a better LED display screen so that she can watch past carnivals of Rio on TV in the more vivid image. I mean, it's kind of a rather rudimentary example, but this crisis is changing the demand pattern, and my prediction is that countries with a stronger manufacturing base, such as Germany, South Korea, Switzerland, they'll do better in relative terms than more service-based economies like the US and the UK. Well, Brazil would have been in the first category 20 years ago, but not anymore. It has experienced one of the biggest deindustrializations in the human history. the share of manufacturing, well, depending on exactly which number, the data set you look at, the share of manufacturing going down from over 30% of GDP down to basically 10% in the last 30 years. So, you know, I mean, of course, that in Brazil, a lot of that has been taken up by export of primary commodities rather than services, but still, I mean, it's not a very positive configuration for future of Brazil. The fourth category of highly likely and predictable changes are changes that are going to happen in terms of global supply chains. And in the last 3 decades, with liberalization of foreign direct investment, development of the information technology, you know, opening up the former communist countries like China and Vietnam, supply chains have been completely reorganized on a global scale. Of course, it's not as if before the 1990s there was no global supply chain. I mean, countries like South Korea and Taiwan that used to make things for American companies, American department stores from the 1960s and 70s. So, you know, it's not that these global supply chains are new, but I mean, the scale of it, and especially the concentration of it has increased hugely. So you have in many industries, you know, 3-4 global companies controlling 60, maybe even 70% of the market, getting supplies from, once again, very few suppliers, because now that you concentrate production in places with the lowest production cost, and you deliver them, you know, so-called just in time, but through this global logistics networks. The current crisis, however, has revealed the fragility of this system. You know, for example, when China was first hit by corona pandemic back in January and February, a lot of automobile factories in South Korea and Germany shut down, not because people didn't want to buy cars anymore, but because they were not getting the necessary parts from their suppliers in China. So, you know, as they experienced that, and also experienced shortages of medical equipment, medical supplies, a lot of people started talking about so-called reshoring, basically bringing production back home. And some people even predicted that this is going to completely reorganize the global supply chains. But this is, in my view, highly unlikely. And yeah, already evidence is emerging that reshoring is not really happening on any large scale. Well, first of all, that is very expensive to reshore. You know, that when you have decided to produce all the Apple products in China, to get all the parts that you need for iPhones and so on from countries like Japan, South Korea, and Germany. The Americans basically did that because this is most cost efficient. Yeah, Donald Trump might want to bring the Apple factories back home, but you know, Apple's not going to do it voluntarily, because it means that their products are going to become very expensive. So there is the cost consideration, but more importantly, many countries cannot reshore on a large scale, even if they wanted, even if they were willing to accept the cost, because they have already experienced at a large scale deindustrialization and have destroyed their industrial ecosystems. I mean, countries like the UK, the US, and increasingly Brazil are in this category. Not that Brazilian companies invest a lot abroad to produce things. So that Britain, the US, these countries, even if they wanted to bring back some industries home, they cannot do it because they don't have the right infrastructure, they don't have the workers with right skills, they don't have the research organizations that can help them. You know, they don't have supplier firms. So I don't think that this reshoring is going to happen on any significant scale. Having said that, I mean, it's not as if that global supply chains will not be reorganized, because people have seen the dangers of too much concentration. So, you know, a lot of companies are talking about China plus one. Basically, instead of getting all their inputs from a company in China, maybe they'll try to get it from a company in Vietnam or Indonesia, because, you know, the thinking is that, I mean, if one country gets some kind of pandemic or some natural disasters like earthquake and so on in the future, they can always have another supplier, so they don't have to shut down factories. Yeah? So the companies are going to diversify their supply sources. They will increase inventory to create a bigger buffer in case that there's a disruption in supply chains. They are probably going to train more workers to acquire multiple skills, because they might have to adapt to changing requirements, and you cannot do that with workers who know how to do only one thing. But even this is not as easy as it sounds, you know. Okay, I mean, if you are talking about relatively low technology products that can be produced in Vietnam instead of China, can be produced in Indonesia instead of Taiwan, yeah, then it will be possible to diversify supply sources. But for many high-end, high-tech products, their supplies concentrated exactly because these are difficult things to produce. So when Japan was hit by this massive earthquake about 10 years ago in the prefecture of Fukushima, you know, that a lot of electronics firms that had trouble, electronics and automobile firms had trouble securing some inputs, because they were these things were produced by very few companies, maybe 2 companies in Japan, 1 company in Germany, 1 company in Switzerland, and 1 company in Japan happened to be supplying 70% of world output. So when that factory got destroyed by the earthquake, the world supply of that particular input decreased by 70%. So, but why was it like that? It was because exactly because these products are difficult to produce. You know? There aren't that many companies, there aren't that many countries that can produce these things. So even if you wanted to diversify your supply sources, you cannot do it that easily. You might have to invest in, you know, the research and worker training and a lot of difficult things, expensive things to be able to do that. So this reorganization of global supply chains is going to happen, but not in the form of massive reshoring, not even in terms of the massive diversification of sources. There'll be some diversification, but mainly for low-end products, and increasing inventory and things like that. But once again, it's not going to be on a scale that many people imagine it to be. Okay, having looked at these highly likely and predictable changes, let's look at less likely, although likely, but not as likely as the first set of changes, and difficult to predict changes. Difficult to predict mainly because these are more, these will involve more political changes, more conflicts, and so on. So that in the first of these changes, I think there'll be an expansion and reorganization of the role of the state. The crisis has undermined a huge range of the fundamental dogmas of orthodox economics, especially regarding the boundary between the market and the state. So in the last 3 decades, the world has been dominated by neoliberal orthodoxy, saying that the smaller the government is, the better, the more institutionally constrained by laws and the constitutions, like, I don't know, the legal ceiling on the public debt or balanced budget law and so on. It is the more institutionally constrained the government is, it is better for the economy. But once this crisis happened, a lot of countries, including countries like the US and the UK, which were at the forefront of this neoliberal orthodoxy, they have just abandoned many of these and did whatever is necessary to prop up the economy and maintain people's living standard. Yeah? So I was already talking about enterprise subsidies, employment subsidies. As a result, many governments have been running huge budget deficits. The US and other governments, especially the ones without strong welfare state, send kind of what is sometimes known as helicopter money. You just give every unemployed person $600 per month, as they did in the US for like 4 or 5 months. The German government, famous for its fiscal conservatism, back in March abolished the ceiling on public debt. That kind of the famous institutional constraint on the government fiscal freedom was abolished, because the German government realized that without abolishing that the law, they cannot manage the crisis. For 6 months, now it's winding it down, but the UK government have paid 80% of the wages of workers who are not working, but were still hired by the company in order to keep up employment. Some countries are even thinking of issuing government bonds with the negative interest rate. So instead of lending money to the government and getting interest paid, you are actually paying the government to lend money to it. So these are all kind of things that were like unimaginable in many of these countries before the crisis. And yeah, as I said earlier, all of these have destroyed the dogma that a smaller and an institutionally more constrained government is a better government. So after the crisis, having seen that actually it is not going to create fiscal disaster, even if you abolish the legal ceiling on public debt, is not going to recreate communism if the government pays 80% of people's wages and so on. Having seen this after the crisis, there will be definitely an expansion in the role of the state in many countries. More specifically, I think there will be a shift away from unfocused macroeconomic policies like fiscal policy and monetary policy towards more targeted policies like industrial policy and technology policy. Even within macroeconomic policies, I think they will be moved away from monetary policy to fiscal policy, which is more targeted. So that there'll be significant shift in government policy, but it's difficult to predict exactly what kind of shift will happen in which country, because all of these are highly political, and the outcome of these shifts will be determined by each country's peculiar political economy and ideological taboos and so on. But I think that some of these changes will happen in all countries, regardless of their official ideological tendency. Second group of likely but difficult to predict changes, I would argue, will be expansion of the welfare state and strengthening of labor rights. This pandemic has shown that no one is safe unless everyone is safe when there is a pandemic. That is, it has shown that public health cannot be maintained in the face of a pandemic unless everyone has some degree of security in income and also employment. So in countries with weak welfare state and a high degree of precarious employment and low labor rights, weak labor rights, poor people kept working even when they are sick and spread the disease more. This obviously was the case in developing countries with a large informal sector, like Brazil, India, and so on. But this was also the case in the United States. In Europe, there's increasingly precarious employment, but workers have a lot of basic rights, like if they get sick, they can get sick pay, even if they don't work. If they get unemployed, they can claim relatively generous unemployment benefit, which could be up to 70% of your salary in some countries. And if you were not officially employed, but experience health crisis or whatever, and experience a significant reduction in income, you can get income support from the government. None of these, some of it exists, but none of these exist in strong form in, for example, in the US. So, people had to go out and, deliver parcels or work in the supermarket, even if they had that coronavirus, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to eat. So having experienced this and having seen how important this the welfare state and labor rights are, And indeed, even in countries with decent welfare state, the crisis has revealed crucial gaps in the welfare state, because welfare state that typically has been constructed with people with regular employment in mind, but how about self-employed people? How about the casualized workers? The Uber drivers and delivery workers for food delivery companies. So even countries with a decent welfare state are looking at it again, but a lot of countries are now talking about strengthening the welfare state and strengthening welfare rights. So stronger unemployment insurance that covering self-employed people, the paid sick leave, better income support, and so on. These are some of the measures that are being discussed in this regard. Once again, I mean that different countries need different things, and whether they can implement the necessary changes that is highly dependent on the country's politics, or it's difficult to predict exactly who's going to get what, but I think there will be changes in this regard. The third likely but difficult to predict change that will come, I would say, is the re-evaluation of social priorities. During the pandemic, societies have come to accept that some human labor is more important for the survival and the safety of society than others. So health workers, care home workers, people working in food production, food processing, education, grocery stores, delivery services, these are turned out to be vital in maintaining the society. And in Britain, these workers were called key workers. In the US, they were called essential employees, and they were given some priority. For example, in Britain, if you're a key worker, you could go to the supermarket and buy things that are in short supply before the supermarkets can sell them to ordinary customers. And during the pandemic, many people have also come to recognize the vital importance of unpaid household work and care work done at home, mostly by women. Now, these kind of categories of work that I have mentioned are collectively called the reproductive economy and the care economy, or the care economy. So that people have come to realize that the reproductive economy is very important for society's survival, and these types of work are more important than, I don't know, the acting or investment banking and so on. Now, when you think about it, this is a heresy from the point of view of mainstream neoclassical economics, because in that economics, the value of everything is determined by the price they get in the market. So if you are getting poorly paid as a worker in an old people's care home, the investment banker who gets at 100 times what you get, he must be 100 times more valuable to society according to this market economics. And indeed, neoclassical economists have gone further than that and argue that trying to put artificial values on things through non-market mechanisms like central planning or some ethical system will not only lead to inefficiency, but also leads to infringement of the individual freedom. So according to this economic theory, there is no hierarchy of social needs that can be imposed top-down. The only judgment that matters in judging how valuable things are should be the market. But when you begin to say that, oh, some work is more essential, some work is vital, some work is more important, you are rejecting that fundamental principle of neoclassical economics. And now that, I mean, it's not advanced as much as it should have, but conversation is starting in many societies to figure out how you provide better compensation and social recognition for the work conducted in the reproductive economy. So you could pay, raise the minimum wages for workers in the reproductive economy. So you could raise minimum wages for people working who work in the old people's care home or in supermarkets. We can improve their working conditions or job security through labor market regulation. To recognize the value of household work, we can think about many things, explicit payment for household work through the welfare state, or longer and better paid parental leave in order to recognize the social value of child rearing, higher subsidies for childcare. There are many other things that you can discuss, but the point that I'm trying to make is that the conversation is already started to reset social priorities. This the view that there's no such thing as social priorities. You just leave it to the market, and market will sort it out. That view is now increasingly under attack, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, when people talk about ways to recognize certain the value of certain labor. Finally, this the crisis is likely to bring about changes in the global economic and political order. One thing that was very interesting in this crisis is that many rich countries have shown high degree of disorganization and incompetence in managing the pandemic and managing the economy, whereas many developing societies, including some of the very poorest ones like Vietnam, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and the Indian state of Kerala, they have managed the pandemic very well. I think less than 10 people have died in Vietnam. And this has made a lot of developing countries lose their inferiority complex, if you like, vis-a-vis the rich countries, many of whom are their former colonial masters, because they've seen that, well, the British, the French, the Spaniards, they've been lecturing us that they are superior, they are, the more civilized, they are better organized, they are more efficient. And then you see that these countries completely fall apart. So now a lot of developing countries are saying, well, hang on a minute. I mean, why were they always why were we always feeling inferior to those countries in Europe? Actually, they are not that great. So I think that's creating a big psychological shift among the developing countries. And also partly as a result of these differences in pandemic management, the developing economies are going to suffer much less from the crisis in economic terms, accelerating the trend of relative increase in the economic power of developing countries that have happened in the last few decades. In the mid-1970s, the rich countries that accounted for nearly 80% of world output. Now it's at more like at 63%, and it will fall even further after this pandemic, because European countries are going to shrink by 10%. China's going to grow by 1%, and the for a while, this will continue, and that will accelerate even more this trend towards the shift in power to the developing world. And the combination of this psychological shift and the shift in the economic balance, I think, will make the developing countries more assertive in demanding the reform of the international economic order in the coming years. Once again, I mean, it's difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen, because international negotiations are quite complicated. I mean, who knows that how China will behave, who will go into alliance with whom, with a government like the Bolsonaro government. Brazil isn't going to call for a more kind of equitable world order. So, we can easily predict how things are going to develop, but I think it is certain that the shift is going to happen. I don't know how much, I don't know exactly how, I don't know exactly when, but it will happen. So, okay, let me conclude. So we have these changes that are almost inevitable and immediate results of this pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, but there are changes which have become more likely as a result of this pandemic, but whose the future courses are more difficult to predict, because these involve changes in individual and social value systems, changes in policies and institutions, and will inevitably involve political conflicts and compromises. So it's more difficult to predict. But if you see it from the other side of the argument, basically it means that it is up to us as individuals, as groups, as nations, and as the humanity, whether we can learn the right lessons from the current crisis and introduce these changes that will make our economy and society better through appropriate political compromises and changes in policies and institutions. And I think that is the only way that we can repay what that those million people, and I'm sure the number will increase, that a lot more million people that have been sacrificed by this the disease. Okay, let me stop there and have a discussion with you.
So thank you, Professor, for the very interesting and informative lecture. I guess our audience, our students and professors are really excited to have the opportunity to discuss these issues with you. So we will do some rounds of questions. I will gather two in this first round. So Pierre Wayon is asking, COVID-19 pandemic underscores society's reliance on women both on the front line and at home. Women and girls face disproportionate impacts with far-reaching consequences. Do you have any suggestions for rectifying these long-standing inequalities? This is the question of Pierre.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Do you prefer to answer directly? Okay.
Yeah, one by one, I think. It's better. Yeah. So no, I've already talked about the reproductive economy, the care economy. Yeah, I mean the most the people working in that economy, which is the fundamental to our survival and the functioning of the productive economy. Most of the people who sustain that economy are women. Yeah? So household work, childcare, care for the old people, a lot of health workers, a lot of teachers. Yeah, so I think that the way forward is to use this pandemic as an opportunity to make people realize how essential this reproductive economy is and how important it is to recognize its social value and make the right recognition and compensation for the people who are in those activities, who are mainly women. Yeah? And as I said earlier, in order to do that, we need to part with this market-based valuation of things. Yeah? Investment banker gets the $2 million US, care home worker, per year, the care home worker gets the $30,000 a year, if that. I mean, does it mean that this investment banker is at 60 times the more valuable to society than the care home worker? No, it's not like that. Yeah. So that I think this pandemic has actually made people realize how important this reproductive economy is. So we have to keep talking about this. In Britain, at the height of the corona crisis back in the spring, April, May, they introduced this practice of the clapping for healthcare workers every Thursday, 8 o'clock in the evening. Yeah, it was a nice gesture, but after a while, the nurses started saying, well, we cannot live by eating hand claps. Pay us the proper wages, because they are grossly underpaid. So I think that we need to use this as the starting point for restraining the market, because when you think about the market is essentially $1, one vote system. If you have money, basically you will make things that you like more valuable, so that those who benefit from the patriarchal system, including myself, that they would not voluntarily give more money to the women working in the care homes or the cleaning offices and so on. So, the society has to make them pay more. And if you leave things to the market, this is not going to happen, period. So we need to use this as an opportunity to talk about the importance of the reproductive economy and introduce the mechanisms, non-market mechanisms, the minimum wages, the labor market regulations, the kind of payment for household work through the welfare state, all kinds of things to make this make this change.
So thank you. The second question we have here is from Nayana. She's saying, Professor Chang, congrats for your lecture. I would like you to say a few words about COVID-19, about how COVID-19 has deepened precarization of labor as liberalized workers are peripheral to the social protection systems.
Yes, well, yeah, this crisis has really revealed the importance of the job security. I mean, even in countries with good welfare state, people with precarious jobs, people do not have a stable employment contract, or the weaker section of the self-employed sector, who basically survive by exploiting themselves. I mean, even in the countries with the good welfare state, these people have suffered a lot more. And as the questioner has mentioned, for some people, it has made things even worse because you used to be hired in a more stable sector, and then because of this economic crisis, you are unemployed, and then you suddenly have to work as a so-called precariat. You don't have any secure job. You don't have even that regular supply of work. I mean, this, I don't know, delivery company might send you a text asking you, can you deliver this in this area? I mean, if it comes, you do the work, but it may come, it may not come. So I think this is, once again, it depends on how you use this crisis, because you could use this crisis to weaken labor rights even more, because people are desperate. I mean, they don't have jobs, the unemployment is rising. But if you could somehow change the conversation, organize different groups to use it as an opportunity to make the employment more secure. And I'm not necessarily saying that that you should make the firing of people more difficult. Well, you could introduce generalized unemployment insurance, not tied to any particular job. As far as that you can show that you have been working, that should be given some kind of unemployment insurance. You could do it by not necessarily making the kind of firing the more difficult, but by expanding basic income support. If you get unemployed, if you fall, experience a big fall in your income because you don't have a regular supply of work, then you should be able to get some support from the welfare system. I think a lot of things will depend on how we change the conversation, and what kind of fights, what kind of compromises we make to create that basically a welfare and labor system that will make people's lives more secure.
Well, thank you, Professor Chang. We have, I'll try to group two questions in one. The first one is from Vitor Xavier. He asks, some countries like South Korea see the switch into a digital economy as a necessity to overcome the crisis. Would the pandemic be able to accelerate technological changes in developing countries as well? And I plug this one with a question from Pedro Viana Durante. He asks if the Green New Deal can bring a new perspective to development policies, and how the Green New Deal and these technological changes can interact.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mean, when there's a big economic crisis, some new technologies that get adopted very quickly. So that's a well-known fact. But I mean, this time, that aspect of a crisis will be kind of intensified, because I mean, it's not just that you need, I don't know, new products to earn money, but that you need new technologies to manage the world differently because of this increasing threat of pandemic. That this pandemic, I mean, no one predicted this particular pandemic at this point, but a lot of the epidemiologists and environmental scientists have been warning us, at least for the last couple of decades about the increasing risk of pandemic, because the human society is encroaching upon nature. The pathogens do not jump between species that easily, but if you keep pushing nature, the probability of this increases. So we have seen SARS and MERS and other forms of coronavirus, Ebola. The increasing the probabilities of this, and now we are hit by this. So there will be pandemic in the future. And yes, as a result of this, we need to reorganize society in different ways. So if you want less crowding, more safe human interactions, then yeah, you definitely need more digital technologies. And indeed, some of my friends who work in the digital economy sector in South Korea, where I am from, they say that their business has never been better. Because a lot of for example, if you want to provide remote medical services, then you need geolocation, and that has to be combined with all kinds of electronic technologies. So there we go. Likewise, the Green New Deal, the climate change is even more urgent realities, urgent reality that we have to confront, because it's been a bit overshadowed by the pandemic. But think about the huge wildfire in Australia, in the west coast of the United States, now in Paraguay, hurricanes in the east coast of the United States, heat waves in Europe, it's happening. So that's another thing that we need to confront. And the technologies have to be important part of solution to climate change. It's not enough, and I'm totally against that. Those typically American solution to climate change, like the paint all the roofs white, so that they reflect sunlight, shoot particles into air that to neutralize CO2. But new energy technologies, especially technologies to help developing countries cope with increasing incidences of extreme climate. So yes, the investment in the green technologies is going to become very important. So yeah, I think that this pandemic can be and should be used as an important kind of the turning point in developing new technologies, new economic activities, new ways of organizing society, in a way that makes our society more equitable and more environmentally sustainable, and indeed technologically more dynamic. I don't agree with this view that that in order to achieve equality, greater equality, and greater sustainability, you need to make the economy more stagnant. No, that it can be and should be technologically more dynamic. I think that once again, it is really up to us to decide how to use this crisis as a way of redirecting our economy and society.
Thank you, Professor. We have actually a couple of questions related to the welfare state and in some way. So Paula Bastos is asking especially about Brazil, since we are heading towards the opposite direction of what you wrote. She asks if you have any ideas for us, and Luciano asks another question related. Do you believe in a new social democracy, or do you think that just as in the post-2008 crisis, societies will change the minimum necessary, a brief emergency Keynesianism to resume accumulation?
Yes, well, I don't know. I mean, first of all, what has happened in Brazil in the last 4 decades is truly shocking. I already talked about the massive deindustrialization, to put that into perspective, in the early 1970s, Brazil produced more manufacturing output than all of East Asia put together, China, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, everyone except for Japan, which of course at that time already was a big manufacturing nation. And now, there is kind of completely deindustrialized, relying on export of, iron ore, soybeans, beef, many of which are involved destruction of the biggest rainforest in the world, although your president thinks that your country has freedom to destroy it as it wishes because it's your forest, So it's been very worrying trend, and unfortunately, the period of Pete government really hasn't solved any of the fundamental problems, because sorry to say this, that if you are a supporter of Pete government, I admire the some of the things that the government did, but the basic regime of accumulation was not changed from what was established after the debt crisis. Basically, it went into alliance with finance capital, and by getting its economic support, it was able to reduce poverty and reduce inequality a little bit through programs like Bolsa Familia, through creating a lot of kind of lower level jobs in the service sector, but it basically destroyed the manufacturing sector. The interest rate was the real interest rate was one of the highest in Brazil since in the world since the days of Cardoso, and currency was hugely overvalued. Financiers had a party because when you have like 8%, 10% real interest rate, all you have to do is to buy government bonds. Why do you bother to invest in manufacturing, or why do you bother to invest in high-tech sector? You can just as far as you have money, you can buy government bond and have a very high return. So unfortunately, that arrangement, came apart because once the kind of political tide turned and the financiers decided that they would rather go with someone like Bolsonaro, there's nothing to sustain that arrangement, because if you pull people out of poverty by, if you like, administrative measures, like Bolsa Familia and raising of minimum wages, as soon as that government changes and that takes away those arrangements, we have nothing left. So yeah, I don't know how to rebuild Brazil. I mean, like many Brazilians themselves have been shocked by the way that some of the people around you have embraced Bolsonaro and his the policies. Can you rebuild it? I think the rebuilding will require a very hard re-examination of the legacies of PT. Lula, Rousseff, they are great people, but they should recognize that the kind of policies they did was very vulnerable and very vulnerable to the political changes. And if they want to rebuild Brazil, they need to think about bringing about a very different regime of accumulation, because it was a regime that didn't have a viable mechanism of accumulation and technological progress, and relied basically on the financial market and primary commodities. That kind of regime is not going to be sustainable, because as soon as the political party changes, it will be back to square one. But sorry to be a bit harsh on the PT government, but I think they really need to rethink the whole thing. Well, I can understand that in 2002, when everyone thought that Lula was Lenin's nephew, probably it was necessary to have some kind of accommodation of the financial sector. You cannot make a sustainably inclusive country despite the political slogan, the País para Todos. That wasn't sustained by a viable regime of progressive accumulation. So, I don't know. I mean, I have only superficial knowledge of Brazil, but that's how I see it. So it's up to you guys to figure out how to fix this.
Not an easy thing
Exactly.
to do. So moving to the next question, Tito Labruni asks, what do you think about the universal basic income policy in Brazil?
Well, universal basic income, it really depends on how you do it. I mean, there are different types of universal basic income. So if, you shouldn't forget that Hayek and Milton Friedman were both supporters of universal basic income. But their idea of universal basic income is that you basically abolish the welfare state and give everyone, I don't know, $10,000 a year or something, so that they wouldn't starve to death. And that's it. Yeah. And this is why so many of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs love this idea, yeah, because then they don't have to pay much tax, yeah, they don't have to accept the government regulation. They give away a little bit of money, and then they don't have to worry about it. But what is very important is that if you have that kind of arrangement, even if you somehow can raise enough money to give people the level of income that will sustain decent standard of living, which will actually require a lot of money. Even if you did that, unless you have public provision of welfare, in terms of healthcare, education, and so on, it will become very expensive to get those things, even if people have money. So that if universal basic income is going to work, it has to be combined with a strong welfare state. However, a strong welfare state means a lot of the benefits, whether it's in monetary terms or in kind, like the free primary education, a lot of the benefits of the welfare state will have to be targeted rather than universal. So if you want already are spending a lot of money to provide universal healthcare, universal the primary and the secondary education, the government run the pension system, and so on and so on. I really doubt whether you'll have a lot of cash to give people. I mean, if you have to choose between the two, I would go for the first. It's that more important to give people access to basic essential services than giving them cash. Now, I know why people advocate universal basic income, because that some of the welfare state, especially in some European countries, have become very bureaucratic, and there are so many conditions, there are so many tests. You are wasting huge amount of money. People get the huge amount of money that in managing the system. People get humiliated by the bureaucrats. So there's an argument for giving people more freedom by giving them cash, rather than saying that, well, if you're unemployed, if you have worked for this company for the last 6 months, if you this, if you that, then we'll give you money. But I think that you have to be careful. If it's that kind of Milton Friedman kind of universal basic income, no way I can support it. But if it is combined with the good welfare state, and if you don't try to provide everything through this cash payment, then I think it could be a very useful tool, because with the precariat, the emergence of the precariat and unstable employment and so on, the old welfare system has become rather problematic.
Well, thank you, Professor Chang. Now, I'll try to combine two questions. The first one, the two of them are related to the economy as a discipline, right? The first one is from Humberto Martins. He asks if this crisis can stimulate change in economics, theories, and teaching towards a more pluralistic approach. And the second one is from Professor Lena Lavinos. Actually, it's a kind of reaction to your first answer, but it's related also with this one. She was not able to post it on the chat, and she sent me by WhatsApp. She asks that what defines the social and sexual division of labor is not only the market, but broader social features, such as the prevalence of the patriarchy. So this patriarchy is an institution, and as such should be part of a critical framework in economics. And she asks why economists are unable to integrate into their framework a more complex approach to power relations. I think the two of them relate. And how do you see this crisis will impact the discipline, and if you are optimistic or pessimistic about the results of it?
I think, given the time, the answer to this will probably have to be the last one. Of course, in theory, I mean, this crisis should change economics as a discipline, because the mainstream neoclassical economics has been exposed as totally incapable of dealing with this kind of crisis. So, as I said, all the things that mainstream economists said was scientifically proven, that you need institutional restraint on the budget deficit, that the government should never pay subsidies to enterprises. I mean, all of this have been proven wrong, and it has proven totally incapable of dealing with the reproductive economy, especially the unpaid household work that women do, because everything has to be marketized, otherwise neoclassical economics cannot deal with it. So so many problems with it have been exposed, but is this going to change the teaching of economics? Unfortunately, economics has become the equivalent of Catholic theology in medieval Europe. It's an ideology that justifies the existing social system. So things things are happening like this because they have to. So when it is performing that function, it's very difficult to change that, because there's so much money and power at stake. Just think back to 2008 global financial crisis. I mean, that crisis already disproves so much of the economic orthodoxy, but a lot of the mainstream economists have proceeded as if the crisis never happened. Even when they recognize it, they say, oh, it was because of this, because of that, nothing wrong with the economic subject. Even people who are mainstream people who are reasonably critical about the practice, when you try to attack its core assumptions, would immediately spring to its defense. They say, oh, the mainstream economics has become very pluralistic. We have so many different theories. It's only that the textbooks haven't been updated enough. This is wrong, because what they are saying is that they have stolen a couple of ideas from Karl Marx, stolen 2 ideas from Adam Smith, and then they somehow put it into neoclassical economics, and they say that we are pluralistic. No, I mean, the different schools of economics are different systems of thought. I mean, even the Austrian school, which is part of this neoliberal, the intellectual and political alliance. I mean, its methodology is completely different from the neoclassical one. Hayek wrote so many articles which are critical of neoclassical methodology, but these are not recognized. The pluralism is a dirty word. I mean, many mainstream economists still say, "Oh, what is pluralism?" Are you trying to suggest that biology courses have to teach creationism? So I'm afraid that this change is going to be very difficult, which is not the reason not to fight for it. But let's not have illusion. The mainstream economists are not going to say, "Oh, we should start teaching feminist economics and ecological economics and Marxist economics because our theories have proven completely inadequate." No, it's not going to happen. We have to fight for it. So yes, I mean, I think that the one lever to do that is the kind of suggested by the second question, the importance of power relationship. Because if there's one thing that neoclassical economics is incapable of dealing with, or at least try not to talk about, is power. Because the only power that exists in neoclassical economics is market power. Neoclassical economists have written so many articles trying to prove that there's no racism, there's no sexism, there's no patriarchy, there's no discrimination of minorities. Why? Because they just cannot admit that there's a power relationship underlying all the economic relationships. Of course, I'm not saying that neoclassical economics has invented patriarchy. I mean, it's been there for thousands of years at least, if not longer. But it's a central power issue, and they don't want to talk about power because it basically destroys this pretense that the market is a very kind of fair mechanism, equitable mechanism. It's that no one has any power over it. Yeah, so a lot of neoclassical economists have argued that, well, actually don't say that employers fire employees. You could also say that employees fire the employer when they leave the company, because no one's forcing them to work for this company. But then, of course, many of us know what Karl Marx said. You know, I mean, to paraphrase a bit, I mean, in capitalism, workers may have the freedom to choose which the employer to work for, but they don't have freedom not to work. So, but once again, I mean, that kind of thinking is taboo. So, unfortunately, we are still dominated by this group of people who refuse to see power issues in economics, and basically pretend that what they do is science, no value judgment, no ethics, no politics, when the very system of Pareto optimality, very system of the very idea of the impossibility of interpersonal comparison of utility and so on are very particular kind of political, ethical judgment. So yeah, we have to fight this, but it's not going to be easy.
So thank you, Professor. We are now heading towards the end of our webinar. This was a very interesting, great lecture. I'm confident that our students and the broad academic community will benefit from this discussion and the insights that were brought up here today. Now, Professor Fábio Freitas, the head of our department, will say some final words.
Fábio, mic is muted.
You're muted.
Oh, okay now. Thank you. Sorry. Professor Chang raised many interesting points on the consequences of the pandemics, including discussions on the role of fiscal and monetary policies, industrial and technological policies, world trade and trade policies, social policies, welfare state, international political economy, and economics as a discipline. We need this kind
basically everything. Sorry, Fábio. Basically everything.
yes. We need this kind of discussion now, and you gave a lot to us to think. Thanks a lot, Professor Chang, for this lecture. I would also like to thank again Marta, Mateus, Norberto, Lydia, Guilherme, Camila for their efforts in setting up this event. And I hope to see you again in a few weeks here in our channel, in YouTube, in our 9th research journey. I will turn now to Portuguese, and em português agora. Eu espero encontrá-los em breve, novamente aqui no canal do IE, nos dias 20 a 22 de outubro, para a nossa 9ª jornada de pesquisa. Até logo. Bye.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye-bye.
Many thanks, Professor.
Thank you.